Good morning. The Lord be with you. Well, we are now well into Lent, having passed the first Sunday in Lent, and now continuing on into the season. Michelle and I will be traveling, as most of you know from the study questions. We're going to be leaving on Thursday this week and be gone for several days, 19 days counting all the travel days, and be back on the 4th of April. That's the current plan anyway. Um, we'll see what actually happens, but that's our hope for the parameters of the time we'll be gone. So as far as that affects the Monday study group, I will make this video today on Psalms 54 and 55. And then there is no activity for the Monday study group except what you might plan to do on your own, reading ahead a little bit in the Psalms and in your commentary on the Psalms, or catching up, as it were, for some of us on the videos and the study questions. If you wish to do that, there's no need to do that. In fact, brand new people could start this course, since the Psalms are not a story that has a continuing narrative and requires people to know the beginning of the story. New people could start this study at any point. But we'll do Psalms 54 and 55 today, and then that will be it until the 5th of April. So we will, on the 5th of April, my hope is to publish study questions on the next two Psalms. We're doing 54 and 55 today, and then on April 5th, I should do 55 and 56. No, 56 and 57, right? Yeah, we're doing 54 and 55 today, and then the next two, 56 and 57, during that first full week of April. And then the next video would be made on the 11th, on Monday the 11th of April, which will be Monday of Holy Week, since April 10th is Palm Sunday. The 11th then is Monday in Holy Week. So that's the plan. You get a 3-week break from the class, no tests, no papers to write during that time. Just enjoy the Psalms. And use the time of Lent for personal reflection on your own life. What I'm finding, and I don't like the season of Lent, have to admit, I did have a spiritual director, Father Casey Bailey in Lafayette, Oregon, a Trappist monk. For 10 years, I met with him once a month, and he loved Lent. I like Advent, but he liked Lent the best season of the year. I think I don't like Lent because if you attempt to take it seriously in terms of a time of understanding yourself better in your relationship with God, it's humbling. It's very humbling. I find that I do not like to be inconvenienced. I like what I like, right? I don't want to change. I have trouble giving up anything at all or adding anything. I always feel that I have plenty that I'm doing and maybe doing too much, and I should stop doing some things. But they're good things, and they seem to be the minimal spiritual discipline I can accomplish. So why would I stop them? But I find I don't like to be inconvenienced. That was sort of my learning this morning as I thought about my failure to keep a good Lent. I will persist. We'll see what that looks like as we're traveling to a foreign country, but I will attempt to be a more loving, kind, gentle, and helpful person, less self-involved, although I have very little hope for that last request. It will then entirely and depend entirely on the grace of God. All right, enough about my autobiographical Lenten meditation. We move to Psalm 54, a very brief psalm, a 7-verse psalm that has in it the classic paradigm elements of a lament. It begins by asking something of God. Save me, O God, by your name. Vindicate me by your might. Hear my prayer. Give ear to the words of my mouth, O God. So it begins with the request to be heard and vindicated or saved or helped. That's typical of these Psalms of lament. Then it gives God reasons why God should act in verse 3. The insolent have risen up against me. That word insolent could also be translated strangers. And I know those two are very different ideas, but the sense of it could either be the insolent or strangers. And you'll find our translations vary in terms of which term to use here. The insolent have risen up against me. The ruthless seek my life. They do not set God before them. That's why God should act, to hear the psalmist's requests and to vindicate him as he prays. Then there is an expression of assurance or confidence in God. But surely God is my helper. Verse 4. The Lord is the upholder of my life. He will repay my enemies for their evil. In your faithfulness, put an end to them. So this is a prayer for God not only to save the psalmist, but to put an end to his enemies, to in some way stop them or destroy them or do away with them or terminate them, at least terminate them as enemies. Finally, the psalmist ends his brief psalm with an offering of thanksgiving and praise. With a free will offering I will sacrifice to you. And we've been reading a lot in the last few Psalms about the meaning of sacrifice, and that God prefers a sacrifice of thanksgiving and a broken and contrite heart. O God, you will not despise. I give thanks to your name, for it is good. Maybe that's the sacrifice the psalmist here means, that he will be freely offering to God a sacrifice of praise and thanksgiving. For God's name is good, and he has delivered me from every trouble, and my eye has looked in triumph on my enemies. He gloats, as it were, in this last verse of the psalm. So, classic elements of a psalm of lament. Let's look more closely at some of the specific ideas here in Psalm 54. Take note of the fact that it is by God's name that God will save or deliver the psalmist. That word name has been used twice in this psalm, in verse 1 and verse 6. The name of God connoted God's sacred power. There was an awesome powerfulness about the name of Yahweh. Moses wanted to know the name of God so he could tell the Israelites who had sent Moses to the Israelites. And Yahweh said, I am who I am, which could also be translated, I will be who I will be. It's none of your business, Moses. I will be who I will be. But normally we translate it as I am who I am. The name of God is the power of God. And we see that in the parallelism of Hebrew poetry. Save me by your name, vindicate me by your might. So God's might and God's name are here put in parallel in the opening verse of Psalm 54. He's also praying for vindication, which is a prayer for justice. The world, from the psalmist's point of view, the world is not right. And the psalmist wants it made right, particularly as it applies to him and his situation. Please make it right. Vindicate me because of the problem of oppressors and enemies who have risen up against me. If this psalm has anything to do with David and the Ziphites, notice the superscription of the psalm, which I think was probably added later by an editor who found in that story of David and the Ziphites in 1 Samuel um, the phrase "seek my life." It's there in 1 Samuel. It's there in Psalm 54 verse 3. And the Ziphites were Judahites who at one point protected David, hid him from Saul, who was seeking his life, but then they betrayed him to Saul and told Saul where David was hiding among them. So he's feeling a sense of betrayal, that the Ziphites are ruthless and insolent, behaving as if they were strangers and enemies, and he asked God to deliver them by God's name and God's might, God's power. The reasons that the psalmist gives for God to do this are threefold. The insolent or strangers have risen up against me. The situation is desperate. Secondly, they are ruthless in seeking to kill David, to end his life. And they simply don't have a relationship with God that is vital. They don't set God before them. They're not willing to do the will of God. We pray in the Lord's Prayer, "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven," and that means that we pray that God's will would be done in our lives on earth as it is in heaven. But the Ziphites, or these enemies, whoever they are, of the psalmist, don't do that. They do not set God before them. And so they are unlike the psalmist, who does set God before him in verse 4. Surely, he says, in contrast to these people who do not set God before them, surely, he says, God is my helper. The Lord is the upholder of my life. And he will not only uphold me and help me, but he will repay my enemies for their evil. That's part of the vindication or the justice that the psalmist seeks, is the vindication of repayment, retaliation against the enemies for the evil they are doing to the psalmist. And he prays that God, in God's faithfulness, which God has always shown to the psalmist and to Israel, in your faithfulness, put an end to the enemy. It seems like we've been praying that in maybe with less boldness than the psalmist. We've been praying that about the situation in Ukraine, that God would put an end to the war, that God would stop the enemies attacking the Ukrainian people and deliver them and remove the evil power that is causing this loss of life and destruction and suffering and the breaking up of families and the tragedy of losing one's home and possessions and way of life by an attacking enemy. And we may or may not be in a place where we feel we can pray prayers of imprecation about what the Russians are doing to the Ukrainians. But we at least pray that the war would stop and that the weapons would be put down and frustrated and broken and not able to do the evil that they are doing. Most of us don't have the boldness to pray evil against the Russians. They think God is on their side. The Russian Orthodox Church has basically blessed Putin in his attacks on the Ukrainian people, who are also Orthodox Christians. And so we have two facets of the same branch of Christianity praying to God for deliverance from the other branch of their faith. Only God can sort this out, and so we pray that God would put an end to this evil war and the suffering that it is causing for the refugees and for the Ukrainian people and for the Russian soldiers themselves. Put an end to them, the psalmist says, in your faithfulness. And that will cause him to give thanks to God, to offer sacrifice, to praise God's name because God has delivered me from every trouble. You start the psalm by the psalmist praying that God would deliver him, and then the psalm ends by the psalmist feeling as if God had already acted. He has such confidence in God that he can use the past tense and say that God has already acted to deliver him. One little note about this ending of the psalm. In verse 6, the second half of verse 6, it says, I will give thanks to your name. That's that awesome, powerful name of God, the mysterious and numinous name of God, a spiritual reality and power beyond anything in this world. To the name of God I will give thanks, the psalmist says, for your name is good. And then you could easily translate the opening of verse 7 this way: for your name has delivered me from every trouble. We have in the NRSV here the pronoun he has delivered me, but it could very well be, in fact, I think it makes even more sense to translate it as it has delivered me. I will give thanks to your name, O God, for it is good, and it has delivered me from every trouble. This third person singular pronoun can be it as well as he, and it would make very good sense here. In fact, I think better sense to translate it as it has delivered me. Your name, in which I put my trust, has delivered me from every trouble, and I look with triumph on my enemies. There is a little bit of gloating there in the humanness of the psalm. Arthur Weiser, in his commentary on Psalm 54, ends his comments this way, pointing to that human factor. He says that this psalmist, the worshiper, is neither able nor ready to give himself up wholly to God, trusting in him absolutely, and accepting his suffering from God's hand and enduring it patiently. He's unwilling to do this. Human self-will and man's low instincts of vindictiveness and gloating retain their power over the psalmist's thoughts and affect also his idea of God and his relationship to God. In spite of his hope in God, the psalmist thinks of God in a rather human fashion and wants to make use of God's power in the service of his human sentiments. I like the fact that Weiser is willing to admit that there are factors in the Psalms which are not to be emulated by us, even just as in some of the narratives in the Bible. Abraham and David and Jacob and other of the patriarchs do things that we are not to emulate. Just because they do them doesn't mean they're good examples. And here in the psalm, just because the psalmist expresses his vindictiveness and his gloating, his imprecations. You've been reading about that if you followed the study questions and the suggested links that I gave you to 3 articles on imprecatory psalms, that there are these human factors in the psalms that we would not necessarily want to emulate. But I have to say, we had a very spirited discussion in the Monday study group this morning about imprecatory psalms like 54 and 55 and their appropriateness for today. And in fact, we raised the question of how can we legitimately both trust in God to accomplish God's deliverance of people from evil and at the same time also pray that enemies would be stopped and destroyed and put an end to, terminated, which our psalmists, both in 54 and 55, do not hesitate to do. They fully express their human hope for the destruction of their enemies, despite the fact that we are told to love our enemies and pray for them. Psalmist prays for them. His praise, they will be destroyed. All right, on to Psalm 55. It's even worse in Psalm 55. Psalm 55 is a much more complex psalm than 54. The elements that we noted of request and giving reasons and confidence in God and so forth are mixed throughout the psalm. They aren't all put together in one place. Let's look at Psalm 55. It opens like Psalm 54, give ear to my prayer. The psalmist in Psalm 54 had said, give ear to the words of my mouth. So they begin in a similar way with a request to God to hear the prayer of the psalmist who is in a desperate situation. Do not hide yourself from my supplication. Hear my prayer. Attend to me. Answer me. And now we get, in the next few verses, autobiographical description, a rather long and unusual one, of how intensely and badly the psalmist feels. We have no idea what his actual situation was. There are clues here in the psalm. We have to say, it seems to me, just to take it on faith, that he is in fact suffering as badly as he says. This is very intense and passionate, isn't it? I am troubled in my complaint. I am distraught by the noise of the enemy. The noise of the enemy. By the clamor of the wicked. It makes too much noise in my life. It oppresses and stresses me. The wicked and the enemy is noisy and loud, and I just want it to be quiet and for this trouble to go away. They bring trouble. Notice it's plural. They bring trouble upon me. And in their anger, they cherish enmity against me. Here's how I feel about this, O God. My heart is in anguish within me. My heart. The terrors of death have fallen upon me. I'm afraid I'm going to die. Fear and trembling have fallen upon me, and horror overwhelms me. He is graphic in his description of his suffering, and like many of us, he just wants to get out of there. And I say, oh, that I had wings like a dove, and I would fly away and be at rest. I would flee far away, lodge in the wilderness where there isn't anybody. I would hurry to find a shelter for myself from this raging wind and tempest. So I'm a conflict avoider. The psalmist just wants to avoid this conflict altogether, to get out of there. And he doesn't hesitate to describe in great detail exactly how he's feeling, and to write it and to say it, and to know that this would be expressed in a public setting in worship. These psalms were read, and so we're hearing the anguish of the psalmist about his situation. So he turns then in verse 9 from his autobiographical moaning about his situation and his desire to withdraw and escape. He turns from that to the enemy and asks God to confound their noisy and clamorous speech, like God did at the Tower of Babel. Confuse their speech. For what I am seeing is violence and strife throughout the city. Day and night they just go around it on its walls, and iniquity and trouble are within it. Ruin is in its midst. Oppression and fraud do not depart from the marketplace. The enemy is not only oppressing the psalmist, but the enemy is oppressing those who live in the city, doing injustice, causing other people to suffer as well. Patrolling, instead of the police patrolling the walls of the city, the enemy is patrolling the walls of the city, like a town caught in the grips of organized crime, and making sure that everything happens in their power, like a drug cartel or a mafia family controlling everything in the town. and causing oppression and injustice to reign instead of God's way and God's rule to reign. And the situation is even more intensely difficult for the psalmist because it involves someone who is a friend of his, a former dear friend. Notice this emotional language in verse 12 through 14. It is not really enemies who taunt me. He has said that they are there earlier, but he's saying that he's minimizing that now. It is not really the enemies who taunt me. I could put up with that. I could bear that. It is not enemies who deal insolently with me. Notice the word insolent that was also used in the verse 3 of the previous psalm. It is not the insolent and the adversaries. I could simply hide from them. And now he turns to address somebody who he imagines is present, his dear friend. It is you, my equal, my companion, my familiar friend, with whom I kept pleasant company. You are the one who taunts me and is an enemy and an adversary. We walked in the house of God with the throng. And so the psalmist then expresses a word of imprecation against this former friend and against all the enemies he has described earlier, causing him such pain and anguish. And he says, let death come upon them. Death as a power. Death will come and reach out for them and let them go down alive to Sheol. Like Korah in the narrative in the Pentateuch, where the ground simply opened it up and the enemies went down alive to Sheol, to the place of the dead. Why should this happen to them? Because evil is in their hearts and in their homes. They have given themselves over to evil, and they need to be destroyed and to have death come upon them. The psalmist does not hesitate to pray this imprecation against even his dear friend, former dear friend, and against the enemies who've been oppressing him. But in contrast to them, the psalmist says, in contrast to these people who have been unfaithful, I call upon God and the Lord will save me. That is, the psalmist expresses his confidence that God will take care of this situation. He says, morning, noon, and night, I utter my complaint and moan, and God will hear my voice. He will redeem me unharmed from this battle that I wage. For many are arrayed against me. But God, who is enthroned of old, will hear, and he will humble them. He will deliver me and humble them, both sides of the coin. Not only the psalmist's own deliverance, but his doing of justice against the enemy. He will set all things right. And he will humble them because they do not change. They are persistent in their evil. They persist in their war. They persist in their wickedness. They persist in their injustice. They won't change. And because they won't change then, and they don't fear God, notice the end of verse 19, that God will then humble them and deal with them and let death come upon them. Let them go down alive to Sheol. They won't change. Evil is in their hearts. So he comes back then in verse 20 to his companion that he has talked about in verses 12 to 14. And he gives him one of the reasons why he is so angry with his former friend. This companion had harmed a friend of theirs, at least a friend of the psalmist's. My companion laid hands on a friend and violated a covenant with me. That is, the friend of the psalmist had promised the psalmist not to harm this other person. But he did. He went ahead and did it. With speech too smooth for butter, but with a heart set on war. With words that were softer than oil, but in fact were drawn swords. He said something deceptive that led this third party, who was a friend of the psalmist, to be harmed and hurt and to suffer. And for that, the psalmist is angry with his former friend. And then verse 22. In the midst of this whole psalm, the psalmist, perhaps it's the psalmist, Another alternative is that when this psalm was read in public worship, somebody said, by implication, "Stop! Cast your burden on the Lord, and He will sustain you. He will never fail. He will never permit the righteous to be moved." One of my commentaries suggested that in the context of public worship, somebody intervenes, another person other than the psalmist speaks, like in a Shakespeare play where we have different speakers. This new speaker, it is suggested, speaks these words to us. You've heard this psalm, this request for imprecation, this desire for deliverance and punishment of the enemy. And we've heard how much you are suffering, the anguish of your heart and your desire to escape. But let me tell you, cast your burden on the Lord and He will sustain you. He won't permit His people to be moved. Maybe it's the psalmist himself who speaks this word. Maybe he stops himself in the midst of his imprecatory psalm. Maybe he stops himself and reminds himself to cast his burdens on the Lord and let the Lord deal with the situation. It is an unusual verse in that it seems to be addressed to us, the readers of this psalm, the listeners to the psalmist's burden and complaint. The psalm ends with then the psalmist responding to verse 22. He's been asked to cast his burden on the Lord, and so he turns to God and he says, "Oh God, you will take care of the enemy. You'll cast them down into the lowest pit. The bloodthirsty, the treacherous shall not live out half their days, but I will trust in you." So there's an alternation in this psalm, isn't there, between trust in God and casting one's burden on God to act, and the desire for vindication and retaliation and deliverance, both sides of the coin. The deliverance of the psalmist on the one side and the retaliation against his enemies, and that God would do it. The psalmist isn't going to act and do it. He needs God to do something about it. It's far beyond he just wants to escape and get out of there. But he needs God to act, to vindicate himself and to do justice. That's what he wants, what he asks of God here is vindication and justice. And he expresses his desire to put his trust in God, having cast his burdens on the Lord. In 1 Peter, we are told to cast our care on the Lord, for He cares for us. And perhaps Peter, when he wrote that in 1 Peter, had this psalm in mind. Well, that's it now for quite a while. We've talked about Psalms 54 and 55. We will take a break and back again. We'll do this back again with study questions coming to you on April the 5th, hopefully. And then the next video on probably Monday the 11th of April. Take care. God bless. May you have a Lent in which you are willing to be inconvenienced, or at least discover that you don't like being inconvenienced. God bless the people of Ukraine.